Hi, I'm Aarjav Chauhan, and I'll be presenting our paper titled Commoning as a Strategy for HCI Research and Design in South Asia. In our paper, we draw attention to the potential of commons-based approaches and thinking within HCI research and design, particularly within South Asia. Commons are shared resources managed collectively by a community of users. These resources emerge and thrive through collaborative efforts known as commoning. Despite their historical significance within South Asia, commoning practices have been undermined by widespread privatization and development initiatives in the region. Our research seeks to advance alternative development models. We conducted a literature review of HCI research related to the commons, including both natural and digital resources in South Asia. We analyzed the social dynamics, rules, and organizational structures described in these studies using Elinor Ostrom's principles for commons governance. Drawing from our findings, we consider how HCI researchers of South Asia can support commoning practices sustainably by integrating three key areas of HCI research: infrastructuring, participatory design, and assets-based design. Research in the field of commons emerged during the global adoption of neoliberal modes of development and assumptions regarding the tragedy of the commons. These ideas favored centralized state and private control over natural resources such as forests, fisheries, and pastures. Ostrom's seminal work in governing the commons shed light on the shortcomings of centralized control over communal resources in countries such as India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. He documented how communities worldwide have devised innovative self-governing mechanisms to sustain their commons for present and future generations. With the rise of the internet and network infrastructures, the idea of commons expanded beyond natural resources. By the mid-1990s, digital information gained value, leading to concerns about its enclosure and commodification. This led to the exploration of knowledge as a form of commons, which is intangible and immaterial. The knowledge commons appear in different institutional arrangements and sectors, including intellectual property rights, network infrastructures, peer production communities, and open source software. Of note, Ostrom's work highlighted 8 fundamental design principles that captured the essence of cooperative common management strategies at field sites around the world. These principles not only represent core best practices, but also significantly contributed to understanding effective community-based governance for shared resources. Ostrom utilized these principles to investigate the differences between successful and unsuccessful cases of community-led resource governance. This analysis shed light on the various forms of collective participation by commons users and appropriators. Building on the uses of commons as a noun, the verb commoning draws attention to the dynamic actions required to co-create commons in ways that contribute to opening up possibilities for how we care for each other and our environments. In this view, commons are not just external resources, but an expression of how we act together. Commoning takes many forms depending on the local circumstances of its practitioners. It manifests as Wikipedia editors formulate conflict resolution processes, and it also happens as software programmers organize themselves to write code that is freely shared while taking steps to prevent outsiders from claiming it as private property. Commoning is increasingly being looked to as an active form of resistance to contemporary capitalist economies, as it holds the potential to unveil communal relations within and across communities that can act as resources in efforts to counter capitalist regimes. Within HCI and participatory design research, a growing amount of literature has been exploring the relationship between commoning, resistance movements, and sustainable development. The historical trajectory of neoliberalism, development, and private property in South Asia is marked by significant economic shifts, evolving social dynamics, and policy reforms that have destabilized and undermined long-standing traditions of commons-based practices in the region. Development strategies in South Asian countries have largely revolved around privatization and economic liberalization initiatives, formulated and refined throughout the 20th century. Environmental activists like Vandana Shiva have contended that development has been a systematic effort to combat scarcity and dominate nature, aiming to create material abundance in the region. Contemporary development movements in South Asia are not simply a uniform ideology imposed by Western globalists, but rather a contested interplay among individuals and institutions situated within the ambiguous space between the local and global. In the paper, we also draw attention to the influence of innovation culture and intangible forms of property, such as intellectual property, in commodifying knowledge, culture, and technology within South Asia. These factors have significantly shaped perspectives on development, innovation, entrepreneurship, and private ownership in the region. For this study, we conducted a systematic literature review. To do so, we started by developing a corpus of commons-based papers through the searches of the ACM Digital Library. We narrowed our search through 3 criteria: the geographic focus of the studies, the mention of commons terminology within the papers, and their relevance to HCI and HCI for development research. In the first pass, we read the abstracts and skimmed the papers to examine how the terms were used within them. We then removed papers from the corpus that did not fit within the criteria of the study. In the second pass, we carefully read each paper to examine the extent to which they discussed, designed, and used technologies in relation with commons-based approaches. To review the remaining 34 papers, we prepared a rubric. The rubric was developed based on principles found within commons strategies. The rubric was organized into 4 categories: general information, connection of the paper to commons-based approaches, sustainability, and relationship to Ostrom's design principles. For each paper, we analyze how its content fit into the criteria set within the rubric. We address our research questions in 2 finding sections. In the paper, we first provide an overview of commons-based HCI research in South Asia. Secondly, we show how the corpus aligns with Ostrom's design principles. In presenting an overview of commons-based HCI research in South Asia, we examined when and where the research had been conducted, identified the commons in discussion, explored the technologies employed in the studies, examined the participants of these projects, and assessed how sustainability was addressed within the corpus. These findings allowed us to understand the status and trajectory of HCI studies concerning the commons within South Asia. In today's presentation, I will be discussing the subsection, what is being held in common. In trying to answer what is being held in common, we sought to understand the forms of common pool resources and the relationships with the technologies in use. We focus on 2 scenarios within the corpus: instances where digital assets are held in common, and cases where digital assets facilitate the management of physical or natural resources within a commons-based framework. In nearly all cases, we found that digital assets themselves are treated as common resources. This encompasses open source software, peer production communities, and network infrastructures accessible to communities without restricted private ownership. Several papers sparked significant discussions around the role of digital tools in bolstering advocacy efforts and fostering collaboration with grassroots organizations, themes that closely align with the principles of commoning. Interestingly, we encountered only 1 paper exploring how digital tools and technologies could aid in the management of natural commons. This finding suggests promising avenues for further exploration into how digital tools and HCI research could support commoning practices concerning natural resources in South Asia. To answer our second research question, we evaluated the corpus to understand how the papers incorporated Ostrom's design principles for governing resources in common. Examining the corpus through these principles have provided a means to uncover commoning practices, such as sharing and collaboration, connection and interdependence, nurturing, care, and respect. I will present how the corpus aligned with design principle number 1, clearly defined boundaries. Ostrom's first design principle, clearly defined boundaries, emphasizes the importance of participants in the commons having clear understanding and procedures regarding resource, usage rights, and boundaries. In examining the corpus through this principle, we delve into how the papers addressed boundaries and participation, as clarity in boundaries involves knowing who can and cannot engage in commoning activities. Within the corpus, we observed diverse discussions on boundaries and shared understandings across various social contexts. For example, papers highlighted the importance of establishing boundaries on resource access, the complexities of forming community agreements in knowledge commons projects, and the emergence of invisible labor when boundaries are ambiguous. The variability in how community participation and boundaries were addressed within the corpus can be attributed to the variances present in the cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic landscape of South Asia. This diversity poses unique challenges in establishing boundaries, particularly within online communities that thrive on open collaboration and inclusivity. Reviewing HCI Commons research in South Asia through the lens of Ostrom's design principles allowed us to identify activities and socio-technical relationships that facilitate the establishment and upkeep of the commons. In our discussion, we position our findings with previous HCI studies, aiming to offer insights for future HCI research that can bolster commoning practices as an alternative to neoliberal sustainable development approaches. Firstly, we advocate for leveraging the concept of infrastructuring to effectively support commoning practices in the region. In our paper, we discuss the close relationship between commoning and infrastructuring, as both concepts emphasize the dynamic and ongoing nature of social and technological interactions. Commoning practices extend beyond isolated actions. They include ongoing patterns of activity that shape or recreate resources for collective purposes. Similarly, infrastructuring involves the collaborative development of social material resources for participation that fosters relations within and between communities through various infrastructures. By drawing examples from our research corpus, we explore how elements of Ostrom's design principles, such as understanding the interplay between organizations, communities, and social networks across different scales, align with the concepts of infrastructuring. Secondly, as a result of significant emphasis on participation in the corpus, we stress the importance of a more engaged and direct involvement with prior research and practices in participatory design. We note that early commitments in participatory design towards democracy and worker rights align well with the Commons agenda of enabling emancipatory forms of community self-organizing. In our paper, we draw upon a growing collection of work on participatory design and commoning culture to offer guidance for how South Asian HCI research can ensure that projects utilizing the commons can be used, reappropriated, and reframed beyond the initial involvement of the researchers and in ways that suit the abilities and interests of the communities. Third, in contrast to prevalent deficit-focused discourse in HCI and ICT4D work, we propose a shift towards a commoning design approach that prioritizes building upon existing community assets and strengths. In our findings, we note that a majority of papers within the corpus tended towards deficit framing, such as designing for resource-scarce regions and communities. Instead, we argue for attention towards assets-based design as a means to harness the existing assets and capacities in order to sustain commoning practices. Designing for the commons by utilizing existing community assets can offer pathways for alternative arrangements of resource management that minimize dependency on external institutions and subvert exploitative development narratives. We reveal the shared objective of minimizing dependence of communities upon external entities that exist between asset-based approaches and commoning theories as a potential area of exploration for South Asian HCI research. Lastly, we address the emerging governance challenges arising from the application of Ostrom's principles to evolving forms of knowledge commons in South Asia. According to Ostrom, effective governance of the commons typically requires meeting all criteria of the design principles, a condition we did not observe in any of the projects we reviewed. Nevertheless, we found Ostrom's principles invaluable for dissecting the array of institutional arrangements, conflicts, and governance mechanisms within each project. The challenge for commoners has always been to identify, formalize, and reclaim relationships and social practices that empower them to responsibly manage the commons against the threat of enclosure and exploitation. From our findings, we observed that such threats often arise when top-down models of knowledge creation and dissemination override established local practices. In response, certain papers in the corpus advocated for commoning as a means to foster cooperative practices and arrangements that promote collective action, prioritize care, and provide space for resistance against hegemonic governance structures. In this study, we suggest a turn towards platform cooperatives when crafting HCI interventions for development. We believe that this holds promise in generating social, economic, and environmental value for communities and provides a foundation for effective governance of the commons. This approach offers alternative imaginaries of co-ownership, distributed governance, and autonomy. It promotes shared use, enables coordination, acquisition, and distribution of resources, thus mitigating the concentration of power, monopolization, and potential violation of worker rights, issues which are consistently at the forefront of commons research. Thank you all for your participation, and I welcome any questions or comments you may have. I'm excited about the future possibilities for research in this area, and I look forward to continuing to contribute to our collective knowledge.